300 people in that ballroom, and not one of them could have told you her name. That was the whole point. Meredith Quillon, 27 years old, night janitor at the Ashford Grand, had spent 3 years learning how to stand against a wall and disappear. Gray uniform, hair pulled back, hands cracked from bleach, cheap mascara she couldn't afford to ruin, and a tin candy box in her apron pocket that didn't hold candy at all. It held a silver wedding band she hadn't worn in 3 years. Nobody at that gala knew the woman mopping up there. Spilled champagne was married to August Vantris, the man who owned the harbor, the unions, and most of the men in the room. She'd taken the ring off herself. That was her choice, not his, and she had a 9-year-old sister to protect. So when Ridge Halloran walked in at 9:07 with 4 men behind him and picked her out of a crowd of 300, that wasn't luck. That was a trap with her name written on the bottom of it, in handwriting only 2 people in Chicago could read. He made her come to his table. He made her clean. He spilled a glass of red wine across white linen and told her she was clumsy, and she knelt down and wiped it up, because that was her job, and she'd knelt 1,000 times before and it had never once broken her. He grabbed her wrist. He leaned in close and told her to get down on her knees and show everybody what she really was. And she looked around that beautiful room, at 300 faces, at all that money and all those pearls, and she understood something that hurt worse than his hand ever could. They weren't afraid to help her. They just couldn't see her. She was a cart with arms. She opened her mouth to apologize. That's when he hit her. The sound cracked across the ballroom like a rifle shot, and for one long second there was nothing at all, just the taste of copper and a fork, clattering onto a plate somewhere behind her. Then the doors at the far end came off their hinges. The chandelier rattled violently overhead. The string quartet stopped mid-note. 300 glasses stopped touching all at once, and a voice went through the floor, through the bone, through the oldest part of the brain that still remembers why our ancestors feared the dark. Who dares to hit my wife? He didn't run. He walked, and it was the walking that made grown men reach for the table. But here's what nobody in that ballroom knew, and what Halloran had gotten catastrophically wrong. He hadn't come there to destroy August Vantris. He'd come for something else entirely, and the woman on the floor with blood on her lip was the only person alive who'd figure out what. She'd been standing against that wall for 3 years. She'd heard every word those men said in front of her, because nobody watches their mouth around a woman holding a mop. And before the night was over, in a cold warehouse down at the Calumet docks, in front of 5 people who could have ended her with a phone call, Meredith Quillon was going to open her mouth and say one sentence that would take an empire apart. If this story means something to you tonight, hit that like button, share it with somebody who's ever felt invisible in a room full of people, and subscribe, because we've got more stories like this one coming. Now let's head back to that ballroom, 9:07, and watch a wolf walk through the door. The basement of the Ashford Grand Hotel had neither night nor day. The row of LED lights fixed along the ceiling of the service corridor poured down a pale, milky white glow, steady and cold, the kind of light that made everything beneath. It looked like food forgotten in a refrigerator, even human skin. Meredith Quillon began her shift there every evening, her hands pushing a 4-wheeled cart with one wheel that squeaked. A wheel maintenance had promised to repair, since some winter she could no longer remember, and she mopped. The mop touched the floor, pulled back, lifted, wrung out. Touched the floor, pulled back, lifted, wrung out. There was nothing beautiful about that rhythm. No one would ever write music for it, but it was the only thing left in the world that kept her standing upright after everything else had gone away. One thing after another. Some nights, she couldn't remember when she had reached the end of the corridor. Her body kept working while she was somewhere else, usually in a room with a window overlooking the parking lot of Mercy Northside Hospital, where a child was waiting for her to call. She slipped a hand into her apron pocket, and her fingers found the familiar hard corner of the peppermint tin. She had held so many times that the paint had worn away at both ends, leaving 2 silver streaks. There were no mints inside. There had never been any mints. She opened the lid with her thumb, as she did every night, and the ceiling light fell across the silver wedding ring lying at an angle in the bottom of the tin. Smooth, plain, without engraving, without a stone, without anything at all. It was cheap. That was the saddest, strangest part. The man who could have bought the entire building with the loose change in a drawer had chosen a cheap ring for her because she had told him that if it cost too much, she wouldn't dare wash dishes while wearing it. She looked at it for 3 seconds, then closed the lid. She didn't wear it. The empty place still remained on the ring finger of her left hand, a narrow band of skin slightly paler than the rest, and her thumb kept wandering back to it throughout, every shift without her even realizing. The way the tongue keeps searching for the space where a tooth has just been pulled, knowing nothing is there and still needing to check again. People would have thought she hid the ring because she was afraid. Afraid of the men in this city, afraid of phone calls in the middle of the night, afraid of the name Vantris and everything that clung to it. But she didn't hide it because she feared for herself. She had stood low enough in life to understand that men like that wouldn't bother bending down to harm someone who cleaned floors. She hid it because there was her 9-year-old sister, lying on the 4th floor of a hospital north of the city, a child whose name appeared on a list. And a list was something anyone could reach if they wanted badly enough. If people learned that Meredith Quillen was August Vantris's wife, Meredith Quillen would still be all right. She was always all right. She had a cleaning cart and 2 hands, and she had survived things far worse. But the little girl wasn't someone who could press herself against a wall and stand on her own. That was the reason. And the part no one believed when she said it, not even him, was that she had been the one to make that rule. He hadn't hidden her away. She had taken off the ring herself, placed it in his palm, and asked him to keep it for her. He had stood there for a long time without speaking, wearing the expression of a man who had just had something taken from him that he had no right to ask for back. Then he had said, "All right, if that's what you want." It was what she wanted. It was still what she wanted, until tonight. At the end of the corridor, the shift manager tapped his pen against the assignment board and spoke quickly, his voice already hoarse since the beginning of the week, saying that there was a hotel workers' union gala on the 12th floor that night. Important guests. A great many important guests. Then he said what he always said, that the cleaning crew was to stay close to the walls, remain still, and make sure no one had to notice them. Mary nodded. She had heard those words so many times, that they no longer meant anything, like a word repeated so often that it suddenly became hollow. She retied the strings of her apron, pulling them 1 notch tighter, checked her pocket to make sure the tin was still there, then pushed the squeaking cart toward the end of the corridor. The service elevator opened with a short, blunt chime. She pushed the cart inside, turned around, and pressed the button. The steel doors slid shut, drawing the 2 halves of her reflection in the dull metal together into one, and the basement disappeared. The employee restroom in the basement was tucked behind the laundry room, and it was the only place in the entire building where Meredith Quillen knew for certain there were no cameras. She went inside, locked the door, leaned her back against the pressed wood panel with the V-shaped crack she had stared at so many times. She knew every branch of it by heart, and pulled out her phone. She always called at this hour, not because it was convenient for her, but because this was when the nurses changed shifts. On the 4th floor of Mercy Northside Hospital, that brief quiet interval when the one about to leave was already tired, and the one who had just arrived hadn't had time to look around yet, and in that silence no one noticed a child whispering into a phone beneath the blankets. 3 minutes. She had never stayed on longer than 3 minutes. The phone hadn't even completed a full ring before the little girl answered, and her voice burst through bright and clear, as though someone had just switched on a light in a dark room. "Sis." Mary closed her eyes. It was only that one word, yet it took her a second before she could speak. "I'm here." The little girl didn't ask where she was, didn't ask how her shift was going. She went straight to what mattered to her. She said she was almost finished drawing it, that she had been working on it since the afternoon, that she wasn't letting anyone see it yet, not until it was done, and Mary heard paper rustling and a pencil rolling. Across the little table attached to the hospital bed. "What are you drawing?" "A secret." "All right, a secret." Then the little girl said that Miss Delphine was on duty today, that she had lent her a green-colored pencil because hers had broken, and that Miss Delphine said she used to draw when she was little too, but she was terrible at it. Mary smiled into the stained mirror above the sink, smiled at a woman with dark circles beneath her eyes whom she no longer recognized, and she said it without thinking. Before she could stop herself, "I know what she's doing." The other end of the line went silent for a beat. Then the little girl said yeah and moved on to something else, because children always knew where not to dig, and neither of them asked another question. "Sis," the little girl said, "Miss Bramble has a parent meeting next week. She told me to ask you." Mary opened her eyes. On the wall across from her, beside the faded rules notice, hung the monthly shift schedule, and her gaze found her name in exactly that square, on exactly that day, night shift, as always, as every week, as every month. "Of course," she said. "I'll be there." The little girl didn't answer at once. That silence lasted longer than a beat, and Mary knew exactly what was happening inside it. The child was weighing whether she should say what she was thinking. She always weighed things. She was a child who had learned to weigh every word before. She was old enough to understand what caution even meant. Then she spoke, her voice light, without accusation, and that was precisely what made it frightening. "You said yes in the voice you always use when you say yes." Mary opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The little girl went on. "It's okay, sis. I'm used to it." The line went quiet, and then the call ended. Mary stood there with one hand still holding the phone against her chest and the other gripping the edge of the sink, while in the cramped restroom, the only sound was the hand dryer roaring now and then in the room next door. She turned on the faucet. Cold water. She splashed it over her face once, then again, and when she looked up, she met her own eyes in the mirror and held them there, until everything rising inside her chest settled back down, because she owned only one tube of mascara, bought at the drugstore on the corner, and she had calculated that it needed to last through the summer. She had grown accustomed to converting everything into a single unit of measurement, and that unit wasn't dollars. The restroom door opened. Luella Abascal stood there with both hands, wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, and she had been standing there for no one knew how long. She hadn't just arrived. Mary knew because that pressed wood door always made a sound when someone pushed it, and there had been no sound a moment ago, which meant it had already been left slightly open. "Hey," Luella said, and smiled. The smile looked ordinary. It had looked ordinary for 3 years. Through 3 years of making coffee together, eating lunch together at 2 o'clock in the morning, sharing stories, or at least Luella telling them while Mary listened. "You okay?" Luella asked. "I'm fine," Mary said. Luella nodded, took a sip, then pulled out her phone and stared at the screen longer than necessary. "Hey," she said. "Your personal number is still the same, right? I must have saved it wrong. I texted you yesterday, but it didn't go through." Mary didn't think anything of it. She recited the number, 1 digit at a time, slowly, the way someone would read it aloud for a child to copy down. Luella entered it, and her hand trembled. Not much, just enough for her thumb to slip once, forcing her to erase a digit and type it again. "Cold?" Mary asked. "Yeah," Luella said without looking up. "Cold." Then she slipped the phone into her apron pocket quickly, the way a person puts away something they no longer want to see, and said she should head upstairs first, because the 12th floor was packed, and then she left. Mary remained for another moment inside the restroom without cameras. Then she smoothed her hair, tightened the strings of her apron, and walked out. Something happens inside a person's mind when they see what they have spent 3 years refusing to see, and that thing isn't fear. Fear comes afterward. What comes first is arithmetic. Meredith Quillen stood close against the prey eastern wall of the 12th floor ballroom, both hands resting on the handle of her cart, and for the next 30 seconds she didn't move so much as an inch, while her mind raced faster than the whole of her life put together. The service elevator. 40 steps. She had counted them. She had counted them on her very first night working there, because that was what she always did in every unfamiliar room. Count the steps to the nearest door, a habit she had carried since childhood, and had never told anyone about, not even him. But those 40 steps crossed the middle of the ballroom. They passed between the round tables, between chairs pushed back from the tablecloths, between 300 heads turning in every direction, and no one noticed a woman in a gray uniform pushing a cart across a party. That was true. But if a woman in a gray uniform ran from a party, the entire room would watch her go. The rear door. She dismissed it at once. The rear door was locked at 10 o'clock. Management had tightened the rules after a group of teenagers slipped inside and slept in the emergency stairwell the previous summer, and the key was in the pocket of the head of security, who at that hour was somewhere down on the ground floor. The bus stop, 2 blocks away, through the rear alley, where one light had been broken since Christmas. How long would it take her to run that distance? She didn't know. She had never needed to run in these shoes. Then those calculations stopped, and another calculation began, a colder kind of arithmetic, the kind she had performed every day for 3 years without ever needing a pencil. What would she lose if she abandoned this shift? This shift was one night. One night was a number, and she no longer converted that number into dollars. She had broken herself of that habit long ago. She converted it into something else, the thing waiting at the far end of every calculation she had ever made. What would she lose if she lost this job? This job was insurance. This job was the tiny line at the bottom of a page. No one read except people who had a child on a list. This job was the reason she could still sit beside a bed on the 4th floor on Saturday afternoon without asking anyone's permission. She could lose all of that in 40 steps, and no one in this room would know what she had. Just lost, because all they would see was a cleaning cart suddenly disappearing from the eastern wall. There was a 9-year-old child waiting at the other end of it all. The little girl was drawing. She wouldn't let anyone see it. She had just said, "It's all right, sis. I'm used to it." And she had said those words in the voice of someone who had said them many times before. Mary pulled her phone from her apron pocket, hid it in the hollow of her palm, and lowered her face as though she were checking the time. The screen lit up. The message at the top had been sent less than a minute ago, and it was so brief she had finished reading it before she managed to breathe. "Get out of there. Now." There was nothing else. No name. He never signed his messages. He said only people who weren't certain who they were needed to sign their names. Directly above that message, in the stack of notifications, there was a missed call from a number she hadn't saved, placed not long before, and her thumb swept past it without stopping because she didn't have time, because there was always some unfamiliar number, calling a person who owed hospital bills. She put the phone away. She raised her head, and she looked straight across that glittering room, past shoulders and glasses and the string quartet playing a piece she had heard 100 times but had never learned the name of, and she saw that he was still watching her, not glancing around, not searching, watching her, which meant it was already over, which meant every calculation she had just made was meaningless because no one planned an escape route after. The hunter had already sat down and ordered dinner. Running now would be confirmation. Running now would tell the entire room there was a reason to run, and tomorrow someone would go looking for that reason, and that reason was lying on the 4th floor of Mercy Northside Hospital beneath a name on a list. Staying was a gamble. Staying meant betting that a woman holding a mop was still only a woman holding a mop, that she had played that part well enough to keep playing it for one more hour, just 1 hour, until her shift ended. Then a voice called from table number 9. Someone had spilled something. The head server called for the cleaning crew, and Mary knew exactly where table number 9 was. Table number 9 was 3 steps from his table. She pushed the cart away from the wall. She finished cleaning table number 9 in less than 2 minutes, and she had almost made it out, close enough that later she would think about that distance many times, when his voice came from behind her, and it wasn't loud. It was simply the kind of voice that made an entire row of tables fall silent so they could hear it clearly. "You there." Mary kept walking. I said, "You there." She turned around, and when her eyes met his, everything she had calculated during those 30 seconds, beside the eastern wall dissolved like sugar in hot water, because there was no searching in his gaze, no suspicion, nothing at all except an easy certainty, the look of a man who had finished reading the file the week before and had come tonight only to compare it with the original. "Come here," he said, tipping his chin toward the tablecloth. She went back. She did what she had done 1,000 times before, and while her hands worked, he leaned back in his chair with one hand resting on the edge of the table, looking down at her with the pleasant expression of someone watching rain through a window. "Tell me, cleaning lady," he said, his voice as light as though he were asking what time the train arrived. "Does your husband know you're cleaning my floor tonight?" Her hands didn't stop. That was the only thing she could control, and she controlled it. "I think you have the wrong person, sir." "Do I?" His hand shifted slightly on the edge of the table. Nothing had spilled. Not yet. It was only a small movement, 2 fingers gently turning the stem of his glass, the soft scrape of glass against cloth, and that sound made it clearer than any threat that whatever happened next rested entirely in his hands, and that he was deciding when to let it happen. The man seated to his left gave a short laugh through his nose. No one introduced anyone. No one needed to. And then it happened. The thing that always happened. The thing that had happened for 3 years in this building and in every building before it. They forgot about her. Not because she was clever, because she was bent over working, and people didn't watch their words around a cleaning cart. The 4 men resumed their conversation above her, head as though she were one of the table legs, and Mary, her hands busy, her face lowered, Her ears open, listened. They talked about a meeting, not tonight's meeting, another one that would happen later. And the man seated to his right said that out of 5, 4 would be enough. And Halloran said no, 5 is enough. Don't count wrong. They mentioned a woman's name. Mary heard it clearly because it fell into the exact pause between pieces from the string quartet, and it was a short, hard name, 2 syllables, the kind of name that sounded like a knock at the door. The man on the left said she wouldn't agree. Halloran said she wouldn't have to agree. She would only have to sit there. Then he added something Mary didn't understand at the time and wouldn't understand until much later. He said a chair wasn't something a person gained by asking for it. A chair was something a person took by making the one sitting in it stand up on their own. One of the men said something about a date, a specific date. Mary remembered it because it was her sister's birthday. No one at that table knew that. No one there had any reason to know it. But the human mind is cruel in its own way. It hooks everything onto the hooks already waiting inside us. And so that date lodged itself in her memory, clean and complete, impossible to erase. Then Halloran said, still in that same gentle voice, that this wasn't about the boy. Someone asked him to repeat it. He said it again, patiently, like a man explaining to a child that fire was hot. It isn't about him. He's only the door. The whole table laughed, a low, brief laugh from men laughing because the man above them had said something they weren't certain they understood. Mary wrung the cloth into the basin, and she didn't understand any of it. She didn't know which chair. She didn't know who the woman with the 2-syllable name was. She didn't know where the door led. But she remembered. She always remembered. It was the only thing she possessed in greater. Everyone else. Measure than everyone else in that room. A memory sharpened over 3 years of standing close to walls, while people said everything in front of her. A hidden storehouse no one knew existed because no one imagined a cleaning cart could hold one. She folded the cloth. And above her, Halloran leaned closer and spoke in a voice meant for only the 2 of them. You're very good at this. You should be proud. You've done it better than anyone I've ever seen. Mary didn't look up. Then he said the final words before the wineglass tipped over, the words she would later repeat exactly inside a cold warehouse beneath the Calumet docks. Do you know the problem with doing something well when no one is watching? No one believes you were there at all. His hand closed around her wrist, and the first thing Mary thought of wasn't strength but precision. He didn't grab. He didn't yank. He placed his hand exactly where it needed to be, just below the jut of the bone, and tightened with exactly the right amount of pressure, the kind of pressure only someone who had done this many times would know. Enough to keep her from pulling free, but not enough for anyone, sitting 2 tables away, to realize something was wrong. That was what chilled her. Not anger, skill. He leaned down. His breath smelled of liquor and something sweeter, cough syrup or peppermint, and he spoke into the space between her ear and her shoulder, so quietly that only she could hear, telling her she should get even lower, all the way down, so everyone in that room could see exactly what she was. And the entire ballroom went still. Not completely still. Somewhere there was still the clink of glass, the scrape of a chair, and a man at a distant table was still finishing his story because he hadn't turned around yet. But the space around them had fallen silent, a widening circle of silence spreading like oil across water, and Mary knew that silence. She had lived inside it all her life. It was the silence of people waiting to see what would happen next, people who had already decided that whatever it was, they wouldn't become involved. She opened her mouth, and this was the part she would never tell anyone later, not even him, especially not him. She had been about to apologize. She had been about to say, "I'm sorry, sir. I was careless. Let me get another cloth," in the voice she had used 1,000 times with men far smaller than him. That soft, flat voice without a single sharp edge anyone could catch hold of and become angry with. She had been about to yield. She had been about to do the thing she did, better than anything else in the world, even better than cleaning floors. The thing she had learned when she was still too young to know she was learning it. The thing called surviving the night by making herself smaller. The words were already waiting in her mouth. Then came the crack, and during the next 2 seconds, while the ceiling tilted at an angle it had no right to tilt, and the taste of copper flooded her mouth as though someone had pressed a coin against her tongue, Mary didn't think about Halloran. She didn't think about him for even 1 second. And later she would find that strange, that the man who had just done this to her vanished entirely from her mind at the exact moment he did it. She didn't think about her husband either, not once. She didn't think, "Come now." She didn't wonder where he was. She didn't think anything at all about the man who owned the harbor and the unions and most of the men in that room. She thought about the drawing a child on the 4th floor of Mercy Northside Hospital was still working on at the little table attached to her bed, using a green-colored pencil borrowed from Miss Delphine. The drawing she wouldn't let anyone see yet, not until it was finished. In those 2 seconds, Mary thought of only one thing, and that was how the little girl had drawn her sister standing in that picture. Had she drawn her standing straight? Or had she already seen it? Had she seen it for a long time? Seen all those Saturday afternoons when Mary entered the room with her back still bent into the shape of a mop handle, and sat on the edge of the bed unable to straighten herself, and had the little girl drawn exactly that. Drawn the truth, because children draw what they see, not what adults want them to see. That thought hurt more than what had just happened to her face. She sat there on the polished the floor of the 12th floor ballroom, one cheek heating as though someone had pressed an iron against it, that ear filled with a high ringing sound, and she didn't think about getting up. She thought about the green-colored pencil. She thought about what the little girl had said earlier. "It's all right, sis. I'm used to it." And she understood, late and foolishly, in the middle of a room filled with pearls and crystal, that the child hadn't been talking about the parent meeting. She had been talking about Mary, about being used to a sister who was always somewhere else, always tired, always saying yes in that voice. For 3 years, Mary had told herself that she did all of this for the little girl. And there on that floor, in the 2 seconds before the whole world broke open, she asked herself for the first time whether the child had ever been asked what she wanted. Then, at the far end of the ballroom, came the sound of hinges. Then his shadow fell across her, and that shadow knelt. August Vantris lowered one knee onto the wooden floor of the 12th floor ballroom, beside the cart with the squeaking wheel, dressed in the charcoal 3-piece suit whose price she knew because she had once seen the bill left forgotten on the kitchen table and had needed to sit down for a while. He didn't speak at once. The entire room was waiting for him to speak. 300 people were waiting, and he said nothing. He looked at her. He only looked, and Mary, with one ear still ringing and one cheek telling its own story through heat, looked up and saw something she had never seen on that face before. Never, not on their wedding night, not on the mornings when he came home with bruised knuckles and offered no explanation, not even that one time at 4 o'clock in the morning when he told her about his father and then remained silent until dawn. She saw fear. His hand rose, and it stopped about 2 inches from her cheek. It was the hand that had done things he had never told her about, things she had decided long ago she would never ask about, the hand that had signed papers that made people leave this city in the middle of the night, the hand whose meaning everyone seated at the long table beneath the Calumet docks understood when it came to rest against the wood. That hand hovered in the air and didn't dare descend those final 2 inches. And it trembled. Mary saw it clearly. She saw the faint shaking in his fingertips, the kind of tremor no one could hide, because it didn't begin in the muscles, and she thought, foolishly, that she should say something to reassure him, that she was always the one who had to say, something so other people could feel safe. "Let me see." He spoke those 3 words, not loudly, and it wasn't in order, even though everyone in that room had only ever heard him speak in orders. It was a plea. It was the voice of a man asking permission to look at something he had arrived too late to prevent. Mary turned her face toward him. That was all. She didn't have the strength to do anything more. He looked, and in that moment, something passed through his eyes and went dark, a door opening and then closing, and later she would understand that she had just watched a man make the greatest decision of his life in less than a second, and he had decided not to kill anyone in that room tonight. He didn't take off his jacket and place it around her shoulders. He didn't lift her into his arms. He didn't do any of the things 300 people in that ballroom expected a man like him to do. He stood, took 2 steps to the side, and picked the mop up from the floor. It lay there with its gray plastic handle and its wet cloth head spilling to one side, ordinary and insignificant, something no one in that room had ever held in their life. He held it with both hands. He pressed the excess water into the bucket, carefully, without letting a single drop fall onto the floor. Then he carried it to the eastern wall, to the exact place where she had stood for 3 years, and leaned it against the wall. He adjusted it until it stood straight. He did it slowly, with the attention people reserved only for things touched by ritual, and 300 people sat in silence watching a man in a three-piece suit set a mop against the wall, as though he were placing a sword back into its stand, and no one understood why the sight made it so difficult to breathe. He stepped back. He looked at it. Then he turned and faced the entire room. And he spoke. He didn't shout. The shouting was over. The shouting had already broken everything that needed to be broken. This time he spoke in his ordinary voice, and it was precisely because the voice was ordinary that it carried farther. 300 people in this room. 300 people watched. No one stood up. No one answered. A woman at a table near the window set down her glass very gently, as though even the sound of crystal touching linen might be counted among the crimes. At his table, Ridge Halloran was still seated, one hand resting on the edge of the table, and he was smiling, and that was the only thing in the entire room Mary should have noticed, the thing she was supposed to notice. But at that moment she was still looking at the mop standing upright against the wall, standing properly, standing like something with dignity, and she didn't understand why. Out of everything that had happened that night, that was the thing that nearly broke her apart. The underground parking garage of the Ashford Grand Hotel had the smell every underground parking garage in the world seemed to have: damp concrete and motor oil, and something cold without a name. And Mary realized that she had walked through this place every night for 3 years without ever once noticing it. The black car was already waiting in the innermost lane, its engine still running, and Fenwick Arbor stood beside the rear door in his wrinkled coat, as always, with a clean handkerchief already in his hand, because that was his job, because he was the man who always knew in advance that someone would need a clean handkerchief. He gave it to her without saying anything. Mary took it. The door closed. The car moved. For roughly a minute, no one spoke. There was only the sound of tires climbing the concrete ramp and the sweep of the windshield wipers, even though it hadn't begun to rain, and Mary sat there with the handkerchief pressed to the corner of her mouth, watching the streetlights slide past the window, listening as her heartbeat slowed, slower and slower, while something else began to rise inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel all evening. "What did you just do?" she asked without turning her head. Beside her, August sat with his back straight, and both hands resting on his thighs, closing into fists, opening again, then closing once more, his gaze fixed ahead as though there were something worth seeing on the back of the driver's seat. "I made a choice," he said. "You chose wrong." She said it very quietly, and she wasn't angry. That was the thing. She wasn't angry at all. Her voice was as flat as a tabletop, and it was that flatness that finally made him turn toward her. "I know," he said, and after those 2 words, he fell silent. The car reached street level and emerged from the ramp, and the glow of the streetlights poured into the cabin and slipped away, poured in and slipped away, and during one of those brief passages of light, Mary saw his face and thought he looked older than she had ever seen him. Then he spoke again. "I would still make the same choice." Mary didn't answer. There was nothing she could say. She had spent 3 years building a paper-thin wall between 2 worlds, and this man had just walked through it as though it were a curtain, and sitting there now with Fenn's handkerchief in her hand, she didn't know whether she wanted to strike his chest or rest her head against it. She did neither. She looked outside. The city drifted past as it did every night, restaurants still glowing, a man walking his dog, a sign with 1 broken letter. Then she spoke, still without turning, saying the words she had held inside her chest since she sat on the wooden floor. "People were recording, weren't they?" "Yes," he said. "The video was already out of the building, before we even reached the basement," Fenn said from the driver's seat, in the calm voice of a man reading the weather forecast. Mary nodded slowly, as though someone had just confirmed something she already knew. 3 years. 3 years of hiding a wedding ring inside a peppermint tin. 3 years of never standing within 3 feet of him in public. 3 years of lying to the people who made coffee with her at 2 o'clock in the morning, and all of it had just been erased in less time than a song. Then Fenn glanced into the rearview mirror. "Boss." "Yes, Mrs. Vane called." He paused after saying it, and Mary realized that the silence was deliberate, that Fenwick Arbor was the kind of man who was never silent without a reason. "Several times," he said. No one in the car spoke. She had never called more than once. August didn't answer. Mary turned to look at her husband and saw that he was still staring straight ahead, but something in the set of his jaw had changed. Something very small, and she understood that he had heard exactly what Fen wanted him to hear, and that he was thinking exactly what she didn't know enough to think. She didn't know who Mrs. Vane was. She had never met her. She only knew that somewhere beneath the Calumet docks, there was a long table with people seated around it, and that her husband returned home from rooms like that wearing the expression of a man who had just crossed a narrow bridge. But she remembered. She always remembered. And somewhere deep inside that hidden storehouse no one knew existed, a short, hard name of 2 syllables, the kind of name that sounded like a knock at the door, shifted faintly beneath the dust, not strongly enough for her to hear it. The car turned. August's phone lit up in the palm of his hand, and he looked down at it, and he didn't answer. The apartment was near the top of the building that bore his name, and Mary had been there exactly twice during their entire marriage. This was the 3rd time. He didn't turn on the main lights. He switched on only one lamp in the corner of the living room, pulled out a chair for her at the kitchen island, then went to get warm water and a clean cloth, while Mary sat there in her gray uniform in the middle of a room floored with a kind of stone she couldn't name, thinking, foolishly, that her apron might stain the chair. He came back. With 2 fingers beneath her chin, he tilted her face toward the light, so gently the touch was barely there, and wiped away the dried blood at the corner of her mouth. His hand was still trembling. More than an hour had passed, and it was still trembling. And she could see that he knew it, could see him trying to force it still and failing, and she thought that this was the man who could silence an entire long table beneath the Calumet docks merely by tapping one finger against the wood. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't look at it anymore." He didn't stop. He finished cleaning the blood away, folded the cloth, set it down, then stood there with both hands braced against the stone counter and his head lowered, while the apartment remained so quiet that she could hear the wind striking the glass outside. And that was when she said the thing she had kept inside her chest for 3 years. "I said it because there was nothing left to protect anymore, because everything worth hiding had already been recorded that night and carried out of the building. I didn't hide because I was ashamed of you." He looked up. "I hid because I was ashamed of me." He said nothing. "You have an entire building," she said. "You have that table. You have people opening doors for you whose names you don't even know. You have a phone that rings and makes people change the course of their lives. I have a cart. I have a cart with one squeaking wheel that maintenance has promised to fix since some winter I can't even remember. Do you think I took off the ring because I was afraid? I took it off because every time I wore it, I had to answer the question of why you chose me, and I didn't have an answer. And after 3 years, I still haven't found one." August looked at her for a long time. Then he walked out of the kitchen without saying anything, and Mary sat there listening to a drawer open somewhere in the darkness, and when he returned, he was carrying a thick file with a gray cover, the same dull gray used for every tedious document in the world. He placed it on the stone counter in front of her. "Open it," he said. She opened it, and for the first second, she didn't understand what she was looking at, because she had expected to see her own name. She had prepared herself to see her name and the numbers beside it, the numbers she had avoided for 3 years. The envelopes she hadn't opened. Her name wasn't there. Other names were. So many other names. They ran down the page in a column, then onto the next page, then the one after that, names belonging to people she didn't know, men and women and children, arranged alphabetically, one name per line, perfectly even, dull and administrative. At the top of the first page was the title of a fund that covered long-term treatment expenses, and beneath it was a registration number and an address in a building Mary passed every day on her way to the bus stop. 240 names. She turned the page, then turned it back, and she found it near the middle, pressed between 2 unfamiliar names. Not bolded, not marked, without anything to distinguish it, just one line like every other line. The little girl's name. Mary looked up. She couldn't speak. "I couldn't help only you," August said. His voice was very quiet. "If I helped only you, there would be a trail of money leading from me to a bed on the 4th floor, and a trail of money is a thread, and all anyone needs is one phone call to pull that thread, and at the other end of it is you." He paused. "So I helped 240 people, so no one would see you among them." Mary opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked down at the papers, at the column of names running the length of the page, and heard her own voice coming from somewhere far away. "You hid me. Yes, you hid me by helping 239 other people. Yes," he said. And she broke apart, There was no sound. That was the thing. No sob, nothing at all. Only her 2 hands resting on the file, her body folding over it, and tears falling onto the names arranged in alphabetical order, blurring some name beginning with the letter D that she would never know belonged to whom. She hadn't cried when Halloran's hand closed around her wrist. She hadn't cried on the wooden floor in front of 300 people. She hadn't cried inside the restroom without cameras when a 9-year-old child told her, "I'm used to it." She cried now, here, over a dull gray file filled with ordinary paper, and he didn't touch her. He only stood on the other side of the stone counter and let her do the one thing she had never done in front of anyone in her life. Then he spoke. "Love isn't a loan, Mary. You don't owe me anything. I didn't lend you something so I could demand it back later. I only did what a person does when they have something in their hands and the person they love doesn't." On the stone counter, his phone vibrated once. Then again. He looked down at it and didn't pick it up right away, and Mary, her vision still blurred, saw his jaw make the same small movement it had made in the car. "The table is in session," he said. He went downstairs alone, and Fen was already standing beside the car door as though he had never left that spot, as though for the entire hour that had just passed he had done nothing but stand there watching the concrete ramp and waiting. The car pulled away from the building. Chicago near midnight had the look of a man who had just taken off his suit jacket, the streetlights a sickly yellow, steam rising from the manhole covers, and for the first several blocks no one said anything. Then Fen spoke, without turning around, his eyes still on the road, both hands still resting in their proper places on the steering wheel, the posture of a man who had already decided he was going to say this and would say it in an ordinary voice. "You just gave him exactly what he wanted." August didn't answer. Fen changed lanes. "I've worked for you for 8 years, he said. "I've never spoken to you like this before. But I'm going to tonight, because if I don't, there may be no one left to say it to tomorrow morning. 300 families depend on you. You know that number, don't you? 300 dinner tables, 300 refrigerators with food inside them, and none of those people know who Halloran is. And they don't need to know. That's why you exist, so they won't have to." He stopped at a red light. "You gambled all of that," he said. Over a slap, the light turned green. The car moved. "Over what?" August sat in silence. Then he spoke, and there wasn't a trace of defensiveness in his voice. "You remember my rules, don't you, Fen?" Fen went quiet. "Don't touch women. Don't touch children. Don't touch the people who serve you." "I remember," Fen said. 3 lines, hanging on your office wall. Everyone who walks in sees them. Do you know why the 3rd line is there?" Fen didn't answer right away. He thought. He was the kind of man who, when asked a real question, stopped and searched for a real answer, and finally he said, honestly, "No." August looked out through the window. A laundromat still glowing with light slid past outside, and inside, a woman sat on a plastic chair watching the dryer drum turn, and he watched her until she disappeared from view. "Because everyone writes the first 2 lines, he said. "Go ask anyone in this city. Ask anyone sitting at any table. Don't touch women, don't touch children. Anyone can say that. Everyone likes saying it. They say it at weddings, they say it at funerals. They say it and then go home and sleep well. It's cheap, it costs nothing." He paused. "But no one writes the 3rd line." Fen said nothing. "Do you know why?" August said. "Because women have husbands, fathers, brothers, children have mothers. Touch them, and someone will come looking for you. And everyone in this business understands that. So the first 2 lines aren't really morality, they're arithmetic. They're only another way of saying, don't create a debt you can't afford to repay." He turned his head and looked at the back of Fen's neck. "But the people who serve have no one to avenge them." Fen changed lanes again, more slowly than necessary. "The people who carry the food, the people who clean the floors, the people who stand against the walls. You can do anything you want to them in any room, and the next morning no one will knock on your door. No one at all. That's why the 3rd line is the only one of the 3 that means anything. The first 2 are contracts. The 3rd is a law." The car crossed the bridge. The river below was black and flat and reflected nothing. "I wrote that line when I was 22, August said. "Long before I met her. Before I had any table to sit at. Before I had you. Before I had anything worth losing. I wrote it on the back of a bill in a room rented by the month, and I remember sitting there staring at it for a long time because I knew that if I wrote those words down, one day they would come to collect from me." He fell silent. Fen glanced into the rearview mirror, not to check the road. Tonight they did, August said. If I'd stayed still in that ballroom, if I'd stood at the door and calculated and decided that 300 families were worth more than one woman holding a mop. Do you know what would have happened, Fen? Those 3 lines would still be hanging on the wall, in exactly the same place. And starting tomorrow, they would have been nothing but words painted on a wall. Fen didn't say anything for a long time. Then he spoke very quietly, his eyes still on the road. You know he calculated that too, don't you? Yes, August said. I know. There was a knock at the door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, unhurried, the kind of knock made by someone returning a book to a neighbor. Mary was still sitting at the kitchen island, with the gray-covered file open in front of her, and she looked up and heard someone's footsteps crossing the living room, and she realized that Fen had returned, that he had somehow been inside the apartment for who knew how long, that the man who had driven her husband away earlier was now standing only a few steps from her, and she hadn't heard him come in. Then she heard the lock turn. Fen opened the door. That was what sent a chill down her spine, not the knocking. August's man, the one who carried clean handkerchiefs, the man who hadn't spoken a needless word in 8 years, opened the door for this visitor, with his own hand without asking anyone a single question. The woman who entered was probably over 60. She wore an oatmeal, cashmere sweater, flat shoes, and reading glasses hanging from a thin cord across her chest, and she carried a cloth bag of the kind people brought to farmers' markets. She looked like a retired schoolteacher who had stopped by because she happened to be passing, and that was precisely the most frightening thing about her, because Mary had spent her whole life in rooms filled with men in suits, and she knew something other people learned too late, that danger never looked like danger. Fen closed the door, moved into a corner of the room, and vanished from the conversation like a piece of furniture, and Mary thought bitterly that she understood the feeling. Sit down, dear, the woman said, even though this wasn't her home. Then she pulled out a chair for herself and sat on the other side of the stone counter, placed the cloth bag at her feet, and studied Mary's face for a long time, intently and without pity, the way someone might examine a crack in a ceiling to determine where the pipe ran behind it. I'm Odessa Vane, she said. I suppose your husband hasn't had time to introduce us. Mary said nothing. Mrs. Vane opened the cloth bag, took out a thin stack of papers, placed it on the stone counter, turned it so it faced the proper direction, and pushed it across. She didn't tell Mary to sign, she simply left it there. Then she spoke in a warm voice, genuinely warm, and that was the thing. Do you know what makes tonight difficult? It isn't the video. Next week the video will become a joke on the internet, and by next month no one will remember it. The difficulty is that there is a name now. Before tonight, your husband was a man with principles. That was inconvenient, but people could tolerate it. Starting tonight, he is a man with a weakness, and a weakness has a name, and that name is sitting in front of me wearing a gray uniform. She took a sip of the water Fen had just placed before her, though Mary hadn't seen when he set it down. I'm not threatening you, she said. I hate threats. Threats are the work of people who have nothing to offer. She tapped one finger against the papers twice. Sign this, and you lose nothing except a last name you have never used anyway. There will be money, enough that you'll never have to return to that building, enough for you to live somewhere with daylight. And, she said, her voice softening until it was almost gentle, the name on the 4th floor of Mercy. Northside Hospital will receive attention. Mary's head snapped up. I'm not saying I can perform miracles, Mrs. Vane said. I'm saying that in this city there are lists, and on every list there are names no one bothers to notice, and I'm accustomed to noticing. You've been inside that system for 3 years. You know what I mean. The apartment fell silent. Outside, the wind struck the glass, and Mary sat there and understood that this was the cruelest blow anyone had ever dealt her. Is far crueler than Halloran's hand, because this woman wasn't threatening her. She was buying her with kindness. She had placed on the counter the very thing Mary had prayed for every night for 3 years, and told her it was here, that it was real, that all she had to do was sell the man who had knelt on a wooden floor before 300 people for her. Mary looked at the papers for a long time. Then she spoke. You're buying my sister's life with my husband's honor, Mrs. Vane didn't answer. Do you know what that is called? Mary said. It is exactly what he refused to pay. For one brief moment, something in Mrs. Vane's face faltered. You know about that, she said. Did you think I knew because I clean floors? Mary said. Did you think I picked it up somewhere beneath a table? No, I know because he told me. Only once, at 4 o'clock in the morning, when he thought I was asleep. He told me about a truck driver who had driven the same route for 19 years. A man with a name no one in that building had ever bothered to learn, and about the night they told him that if he wanted to keep doing the job he had done for 19 years, he would have to pay them every month. He said no. August told me how he said no, where he was standing when he said it, and how he never went home and told anyone what had happened. Then he remained silent until sunrise, and he never mentioned it again. Mary pushed the papers back across the stone counter. That is the difference between you and me, Mrs. Vane. You have a file on him. I have him. Mrs. Vane looked at her. She wasn't angry. She didn't smile. She only looked for a long time, and there was something in her eyes Mary couldn't read, something she would later understand wasn't contempt. It was a question. Mrs. Vane was comparing the woman sitting before her with something else inside her mind, something she had suspected for a long time but had never been able to prove, and she had just realized that the two might fit together. Mrs. Vane didn't stand up. She remained seated with one hand resting on the cloth bag, and that look still lingered on Mary's face, like a question no one had yet read aloud, and perhaps because she wanted to escape it, perhaps only because her hands needed something to do, Mary pulled her phone from her apron pocket. The screen lit up, and there, above the two-word message she had read, beside the eastern wall a lifetime ago, was the thing she had swept past because she hadn't had time. A missed call, a number she hadn't saved, and beneath it, a small icon she hadn't noticed then. There was a voicemail. She pressed it. She put it on speaker, not because she wanted anyone else to hear, but because her hands had gone cold and she didn't trust herself to hold the phone against her ear, and the voice poured into the apartment high above the city. It was soft, pleasant, the voice of someone sitting comfortably in a beautiful room, calling an old acquaintance. Mary heard that voice, and every hair along her arms rose. But this was the thing, the part she would later tell people and no one would believe. She didn't hear a single word he said. Not one. Her mind passed over the entire message and seized on something else, something beneath every word, and that thing was the number glowing on the screen. He had called her private number, not the hotel number, not the personnel office, the number she had changed twice and given to exactly 3 people in the world. 3 people, a number she had counted and recounted in her head hundreds of times, because that was the kind of thing a woman like her had to count. August, Fen, and... Mary looked up. Mrs. Vane was watching her. Fen was standing in the corner of the room, and she saw the empty third place inside her mind, an emptiness shaped like a paper coffee cup and an ordinary smile and a trembling hand entering a number, and she thought, cold, yeah, cold. She pressed call. The phone rang once, then twice. Then someone answered, and no one said hello. There was only breathing. It was the clearest answer in the world. Luella, Mary said. The breathing on the other end broke apart. I'm sorry. Those 2 words burst out as though they had been waiting at the edge of her mouth for hours, waiting to be released. Mary, I'm sorry. I didn't know they were going to. She didn't finish the sentence. I have a family, Mary. I have a family. You don't have anyone. And then she stopped. The silence lasted a long time, and inside it Mary heard the sound of a person who had just heard herself. Mary spoke very quietly, and she wasn't trying to make it quiet. Her voice simply had nothing more left in it. I have someone. She's 9 years old. She's on the 4th floor of Mercy Hospital. There was nothing on the other end, not a sound. You were my friend for 3 years, Luella. 3 years. You made coffee for me every night. You told me about your husband, about the house you wanted to buy in Berwyn, about how your mother refused to learn English. I know all of it. I even know his birthday. Mary stopped. You never asked me a single question about my life. 3 years. Not one question. There was a sound on the other end, the sound of someone sinking down onto the floor. Then Luella spoke, and her voice no longer had any shape at all. They came to me on Tuesday. They showed me my husband's file. His papers have been pending. You know how long they've been pending. And they told me they only needed 1 number. Just 1 number, Mary. They said they only wanted to scare you for fun. They said that if I didn't give it to them, he would be on a plane this Friday. When she finished, she fell silent. She didn't say anything else, and Mary was grateful to her for that, strangely grateful, because if Luella had offered one more excuse, Mary might not have endured it. Mary stood there with the phone in her hand. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She didn't say, "I understand." She didn't say, "I'll make your life miserable." She said nothing at all. She ended the call. Then she stood motionless in the high-rise apartment through a silence no one dared interrupt, and she opened the voicemail again. A second time, and this time she heard the words. His voice poured out again, soft and pleasant, seated in a beautiful room. There was music behind him, the string quartet, the piece she had heard 100 times without ever knowing its name. And he said that Mrs. Vantris shouldn't worry, that when everything was over he would take good care of her, that she would never have to kneel and clean anyone's floor again. Mary went completely still. She played that part again. Then once more, "You will never have to kneel and clean anyone's floor again." She looked at the small numbers displayed beneath the voicemail, the time it had been left, and she made the calculation she had made 1,000 times in her life, the calculation of a woman who converted everything into a single unit. She hadn't knelt tonight. She hadn't knelt once until his wineglass spilled, and that spill had happened after this message was left. Mary raised her head very slowly. Mrs. Vane was still watching her, and Mary heard her own voice, dry and calm, the voice of someone who had just found beneath a table the thing the entire room had spent all night searching for. He wasn't describing what I had done. The phone in her hand vibrated, and when Mary looked down at the screen, her entire body turned to stone, because the name displayed there was Mercy Northside Hospital, and over the past 3 years she had learned that hospitals didn't call at this hour with good news. She answered with a finger she could no longer feel. "Mary," Miss Delphine said, and the first thing Mary noticed was that her voice sounded normal, completely normal, the voice of someone speaking while holding a cup of tea, and her whole chest loosened by one small degree. "Nothing is wrong," Miss Delphine said at once, because she had been doing this work long enough to understand what the silence on the other end meant. "She hasn't fallen asleep yet. She insists on hearing her sister's voice. I'm giving her 30 seconds, then the lights go out." There was a rustling sound, the sound of the phone changing hands, and then the little girl's voice came through. Sleepy, the consonants blurred at the edges. "Sis, I'm here." I finished the drawing. Mary stood in the middle of the apartment high above the city, between a woman in a cashmere sweater and a man, standing motionless in the corner, and a covered file still lying open on the stone counter, and she held the phone to her ear with both hands. "You finished it." "Yeah. What did you draw?" "You." The little girl yawned. "I drew you standing in a bright room." Mary couldn't speak. "Bright," she said after a while. "Yeah," the little girl said, "because you always work at night. Whenever I draw you, I always have to color the background dark, and I'm tired of coloring dark backgrounds. So this time I made it bright. I wanted you to stand somewhere bright for once." Miss Delphine said something in the background, and the little girl answered, "Yes, ma'am," then said, "Good night, sis," and the call ended. Mary lowered the phone. She stood there for a long time. No one in the room spoke. Then she turned and walked into the bedroom, the room where she had slept exactly 2 nights in her life, and opened the closet. It was still there inside the garment bag, the thing he had given her months earlier, and she hadn't asked why. She remembered being angry then. She remembered asking where he expected her to wear something like that, to clean floors, and he had only said, "Leave it there," then walked out onto the balcony and stood alone. She had thought it was a gift. Now, standing before the closet, she understood that it hadn't been a gift. It had been something prepared in advance, the way people kept a fire extinguisher behind glass. And the man who had hung it there months ago had always known, that one night she would need to enter. A room where she hadn't been invited. She took off the gray uniform. She put on the dress. It wasn't beautiful. That wasn't the point. It fit. It fit so perfectly it frightened her, fitting every place, fitting at the shoulders, fitting at the waist, and she stood before the mirror looking at a woman she had never met, and thought that this man had taken her measurements without asking, simply by watching her for 2 years. Then she picked up the apron. She reached into the pocket and took out the peppermint tin, the one with 2 strips of paint worn away at either end because she had held it so many times. She opened the lid with her thumb. The ring lay tilted at the bottom, smooth, plain, without engraving, without a stone, cheap, the kind of ring a man bought when a wife told him that if it were expensive, she wouldn't dare wash dishes while wearing it. Mary lifted it with 2 fingers. She looked at it for a moment. Then she slid it onto the ring finger of her left hand, into the exact band of skin paler than the rest, the place her thumb had kept searching for, throughout the past 3 years like a tongue, returning to the space where a tooth had been pulled. It fit perfectly. Of course it fit perfectly. She closed the tin, set it down on the dresser, and left it there. When she stepped back into the living room, Mrs. Vane was standing. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Attend the meeting," Mary said. "You weren't invited." Mary walked past her toward the door, then paused for a moment with one hand resting on the lock. "I've never been invited into any room in my life, Mrs. Vane. I still go in." In the corner, Fen moved for the first time all evening, and Mrs. Vane stood there watching Mary for 1 second, then 2, before bending down to pick up the coat draped across the back of the chair and putting it on slowly, fastening each button one at a time, and she spoke in the same warm voice of a retired schoolteacher. "I'll drive." Mrs. Vane drove an old moss green car, the kind people kept in a garage for 20 years, and changed the oil in exactly on schedule, and she drove it slowly, staying in her lane, coming to a complete stop at every stop sign, even at intersections where there wasn't another soul in sight. She didn't say a single word during the entire drive down to the Calumet docks. Mary sat beside her with both hands resting in her lap, watching the city thin out into low warehouses and shipping containers stacked like the toys of some enormous child who had grown tired of playing long ago, and she said nothing either. Her right thumb kept turning the ring, on the ring finger of her left hand, back and forth, the movement of someone who had just grown a mated tooth back and hadn't yet become accustomed to it. Warehouse number 9 stood at the end of a road without a name, a long block of concrete with its back turned toward the water, and it was so dark outside that Mary knew there were cars parked there only because she could see heat rising from their hoods. Fen stood beside the door. He was still wearing the same wrinkled coat. 2 men blocked the entrance, neither large nor intimidating, simply standing there with the expressions of men performing a tedious job, and when Fen stepped forward, one of them merely shook his head. Fen didn't argue. He didn't reach inside his coat. He only stepped back and returned to the place where he had been standing, and Mary understood that there was a law in this place older than the men enforcing it, that only those who sat at that table were permitted to pass through that door, and the driver remained outside, even if that driver had given 8 years of service and always carried a clean handkerchief. He watched Mary pass. He said nothing, but as she walked by, he gave her one brief nod, and that nod said more than every wish of good luck in the world. The inside of the warehouse was colder than the night outside. The high ceiling drew the darkness upward, and in the middle of that vast, empty space, several industrial lamps had been hung low, pouring a pool of harsh white light directly onto the concrete floor, and inside that pool of light stood a long wooden table with 5 chairs. 4 were occupied, 1 was empty. August stood alone at the far end of the table, inside the white light, and Mary saw his back before she saw his face, and she knew she would remember that image for the rest of her life. A man standing straight in the middle of a room that had gathered to pass judgment on him. Halloran sat on the right with his arms folded and his legs crossed, and he was smiling. No one knew how long he had been smiling. Perhaps he had been smiling ever since the ballroom. The steel door behind Mary closed with a sound that echoed through the entire length of the warehouse, and her heels struck the concrete. 1, 2, 3, and in that space the sound was like someone striking an enormous bell from very far away. Everyone turned, and Mary watched her husband's face pass through a dozen different things in less than a heartbeat. She saw the shock first, the naked shock of a man looking at something that couldn't possibly be happening. Then she saw fear, and it wasn't the fear she had seen on the wooden floor of the 12th floor ballroom. It was far greater. It was the fear of a man who had just realized that the only thing he had ever managed to hide had walked willingly into the center of the room. Then came anger, brief, flashing once before it disappeared. And finally, beneath all of it, there was something very much like pride, and it nearly made her knees give way as she walked. He said nothing. He didn't have time. "Well," Halloran said, stretching out his legs, his voice filled with the pleasure of a man who had just been handed an additional gift he hadn't even arranged to have wrapped. The evidence walked in by itself. No one at the table laughed. The woman sitting in the last occupied chair, an elderly woman dressed in black, raised one eyebrow and looked Mary over from head to toe. Pausing at the dress, then at her left hand. Mrs. Vane walked past Mary, went to the empty chair, and sat down. She did it slowly, without looking at anyone, lifting her reading glasses and polishing them against the edge of her sweater. Mary walked the rest of the way to the table. She didn't look at Halloran. She didn't look at her husband. She placed her phone on the wooden surface, directly in the middle of the harsh white light, and carefully turned it until it sat straight, the way someone might place a plate on a dinner table. Then she switched on the speaker. His voice poured from the small phone, traveled the full length of the warehouse, and echoed from the high ceiling that vanished into darkness, distorted and thin. Yet no one in that room doubted for even a second whose voice it was. "Don't worry, Mrs. Vantris. When he's finished, I'll take good care of you. You won't have to kneel and clean anyone's floor again." Behind the voice there was music, the string quartet, playing the piece Mary had heard 100 times without ever learning its name. The message ended. The silence that followed was as thick as concrete. Mary didn't pick up the phone. She left it lying there in the middle of the harsh white light, and she spoke, her voice so calm that even she found it strange. The calm of someone who had cleaned floors for 3 years while people cursed at one another above her head. "You left this message at 9:05, she said. "Halloran didn't move. I hadn't knelt once tonight until your wineglass spilled. The entire ballroom saw it. 300 people saw it. And I remember, because remembering is the one thing I do better than you. You spilled it after you called." She raised her head and looked directly at him for the first time. "You weren't describing what I had done, Mr. Halloran. You were describing what you were about to make me do." Somewhere along the table, a chair scraped against the concrete. "She's lying," Halloran said. He said it quickly, and that was his first mistake of the entire evening, and Mary heard it because she had listened to that voice speak slowly for an hour, and now it was fast. That could be anyone. It could be an edited recording. She could have made it herself while she was sitting in the car. "Then put your phone on the table," Mary said. No one spoke. "Bring it out," she said. "Set it down. Either my number is in your call history or it isn't. This will be over in 10 seconds. Halloran didn't produce it. His hand remained on his thigh, and he sat perfectly still, and the entire table watched him sit there. And in their world, that stillness was louder than a confession. The man seated beside Mrs. Vane cleared his throat and said nothing. Then Mary did the thing she would never later be able to explain, perhaps because during 3 years of standing against walls she had learned that a person could be read entirely by the way he spoke to someone carrying his food. She spoke slowly. "But you weren't careless, were you?" Halloran raised an eyebrow. "People would think your hand slipped," she said. "They would think you called the wrong number, that you forgot a voicemail remained behind. No, you could have had someone else make the call. You could have sent a message from a disposable phone. You have an entire building full of people, willing to do that filthy work for you. But you called me yourself, in your own voice, on my private number." She drew in a breath. "Because you wanted me to hear it. There wasn't a sound in the warehouse. You wanted me to walk to that table, with your voice already inside my ear," she said. "You wanted me to pour your wine while I knew. 4 minutes. You gave me exactly 4 minutes to understand that something was going to happen, and that I couldn't do anything about it. That is what you enjoy most, isn't it, Mr. Halloran? Not winning. Winning is too quick. Winning is boring. You enjoy the part where people know in advance that they're about to lose." Halloran shot to his feet. His chair overturned behind him, striking the concrete with a crash that rang through the warehouse, and his face had changed color, and the pleasant manner polished over 30 years fell away from him like peeling paint. "You sit here," he roared, turning toward the table. "You sit here and listen to a floor cleaner. What is she? She is a rag. You wring it out and hang it up, and the next morning no one can even remember what color the rag was." Mary wasn't angry. She realized that at once, and it surprised her more than it surprised anyone else in the room. She felt nothing at all. She simply took one step forward, deeper into the pool of light, and spoke in the ordinary voice she had used for 3 years to say, "Yes, sir. I've cleaned your private dining room on the 7th floor more times than I can count, Mr. Halloran." He went still. "I know what you keep in the bottom drawer of the cabinet beside the window. I know which chair you sit in when you're alone. I know what you say on the phone at 11 o'clock at a night when you think there's no one left on that floor, because I was there. I was right there, 10 feet away from you, beside a cleaning cart, for 3 years." She paused. "You never looked at me once. There wasn't a sound inside the warehouse. That isn't my weakness, Mr. Halloran. It's yours. Mrs. Vane stood up. She did it slowly, both hands resting lightly on the wooden surface, the way an older person rises from a church pew, and she removed her reading glasses and let them fall against the end of the cord. Ridge, she said, give me the phone. He turned toward her. Odessa, give me the phone. And Mary, standing 3 steps away, saw something she wouldn't fully understand until months later. Mrs. Vane wasn't looking at Halloran. She was looking at the phone lying in the middle of the white light, the cheap phone with the cracked screen, belonging to a woman who cleaned floors, and there was no outrage on her face, no justice, nothing moral at all. There was something else, the look of someone who had just found the final piece of a puzzle. They had spent months grinding their teeth over in silence, and that last piece had finally revealed the picture, and it wasn't beautiful. Miss Quilon, she said without turning her head, do you think he staged tonight to bring down your husband? Mary didn't answer. No, Mrs. Vane said. He staged it to bring down me. The table went utterly still. You don't know the rules here, she said, and her voice remained warm, still the voice of a retired schoolteacher, and that was what made it cruel. 5 years ago, the last chair at this table stood empty, and there was a 30-year-old kid with no bloodline, no family, no one behind him. And I was the one who stood up and vouched for him. I put my name beside his. Here, when you vouch for someone, you don't lend him money. You lend him your chair. She looked around the long table. If the person you vouch for falls, it isn't only him who falls. The person who vouched for him falls too. If your husband had been proven tonight to be a man who lost control because of a woman, this table wouldn't have said August Vantris was wrong. This table would have said Odessa Vane chose the wrong man, and a chairwoman who chooses the wrong man is no longer chairwoman. She turned toward Halloran. He doesn't want your harbor, she said to August, and it was the first time that evening she had spoken directly to him. He doesn't want the union. He doesn't care about your drivers. He wants the chair I'm sitting in, and the cheapest way to take it isn't to strike me. It is to make me stand up on my own. Mary felt her entire body go cold. A chair wasn't something a person gained by asking for it. A chair was something a person took by making the ones sitting in it stand up on their own. 4 men had said those words above her head while she wrung out a cloth, and she hadn't understood a single word, and she had remembered them, because remembering was the one thing she did better than all of them. She won't have to agree. She will only have to sit there. I've suspected this since spring, Mrs. Vane said, and for the first time there was a tiny crack in her voice. I couldn't prove it. I came to see Miss Quilon tonight to find out whether she was the leverage, because if she was the leverage, then I would know who was holding it. She looked at Mary. I thought I came to confirm a weakness. She put her glasses back on. It turns out I came to hear a voicemail, and in that moment, Mary understood that she had just saved the woman in the cashmere sweater, and she had saved her without even knowing she existed until an hour ago, and she had done it not with power or money or a gun, but by remembering a sentence no one thought she had heard. Halloran understood it at the same time she did. Mary didn't see him move. She only saw the table surge forward, saw him lunge through the white light, and he didn't lunge at her, didn't spare her a single glance. He went straight for August, because it was the final move left on the board, because if he couldn't have the chair tonight, then at least he would make the other man pay in front of everyone. August moved first. Mary didn't see what he did. There was only one impact, a single, short, heavy sound that struck the high ceiling and fell back down, and by the time her eyes caught up, Ridge Halloran was on his knees on the concrete floor in the middle of the white light, and her husband's hand was clenched around his collar, holding him exactly there. No higher, no lower. No one at the table moved. No one called anyone. August bent down. You hit my wife, he said. His voice was very quiet. That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking I needed a reason. Mary took 3 steps. No one stopped her. Perhaps no one at that table could believe anyone would walk into that space at such a moment, but she did, and she placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. Her hand was small. The skin was cracked from bleach, her nails cut short, and on her ring finger was a cheap silver ring without engraving or a stone. Her hand rested very lightly on his shoulder. August, she said. The muscle beneath her palm was hard as stone. He hit you, August said. He didn't turn his head. Yes, she said. She didn't remove her hand. And if you do what you're about to do, Right here. In front of these 4 people. Then tomorrow morning this city will have a story. The entire warehouse was silent. That story will be that August Vantris killed a man. That will be the only sentence anyone tells. They'll tell it in diners, at the harbor, inside trucks, and they'll tell it for 20 years. And each time they tell it, it will become a little shorter until only 5 words remain. August Vantris killed a man. She leaned a little closer and spoke into the space between his ear and shoulder, the exact place where another man had spoken, into her ear in the ballroom that night. No one will tell the story of how he hit me. Not one person, August. That part will disappear by the second telling. His hand was still gripping Halloran's collar. Then Mary spoke the final words, her voice very quiet. Meant only for the 2 of them. You wrote those 3 lines when you were 22. Don't let him hold the pen. The silence stretched so long that Mary could hear the water striking the embankment beyond the concrete wall. Then his fingers opened, one at a time. Halloran fell backward onto the floor with a breath escaping him, and no one helped him. August straightened. He didn't look down at Halloran. He adjusted his cuffs mechanically, then turned toward the long table, toward the 4 people seated within the pool of white light, faces the city had never seen. Tonight I walked into a room, he said, and I asked who dared to hit my wife. No one answered. I asked the wrong question. He left those words lying in the middle of the warehouse. The right question, he said, is why 300 people sat in that room. 300 educated people with food and money and pearls, and not one of them asked whether she was all right. Not who dared to hit my wife. The question is why. In a room full of people, 1 person was struck, and not a single person stood up to ask whether she was hurt. He took 1 step along the table. You sit here and think you fear me because I'm strong, he said. You don't. Everyone at this table is strong. You fear me because I'm the only person sitting here who still remembers who he was before he had money. That is all. That is the entire difference. I still remember the smell of a kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning. I still remember the name of the doorman at the first building I ever entered. You have forgotten, and you forgot so quickly that you convinced yourselves you never had anything to forget. He stopped at the head of the table. Starting tonight, my rules are the rules of this table, he said. Don't touch women. Don't touch children. Don't touch the people who serve you. The waiter. The person who cleans the floor. The person who carries food to your table. The person standing against the wall while you hold your meetings. Not because they're weak. Because they have no one to avenge them. And a law means something only when it protects the people who cannot demand it for themselves. He looked at each of them in turn. Anyone who disagrees, stand up now. No chair moved. No one stirred. The man seated beside Mrs. Vane lowered his eyes to the wooden surface. The elderly woman dressed in black at the final. A chair looked directly at August for a long time, then gave 1 brief nod, the nod of someone who had sat at tables like this longer than he had been alive. On the concrete floor, Halloran said something too faint to understand, and no one turned to look at him. That was the true punishment, and Mary understood it as she watched him sitting there in the white light, while not 1 person at the table bothered to give him even half a glance. His entire life, he had forced people to look at him, and now no one looked anymore. Mrs. Vane picked up her reading glasses, folded the 2 arms carefully, and placed them on the wooden table. Put it in the minutes, she said. The car didn't turn toward the building that bore his name. Fenn sat behind the wheel without anyone telling him where to go, and he asked only 1 question, mercy. And August said yes, and that was all. The eastern sky had already begun to thin into the pale gray that people who worked the night shift called the color of going home. Mary sat in the back seat in her black dress, her hands resting in her lap, watching the city change color through the window. And she thought that over the past 3 years, she had traveled this road hundreds of times without ever seeing it at this hour. Her phone vibrated just as the car stopped. Mercy Northside Hospital. She answered with a reflex that had hardened into a scar. The reflex of someone who had spent 3 years fearing every call from that number, but the night nurse's voice brightened from the very first word. They had been waiting 3 years for a call. That morning, the call had finally come. There was a compatible donor, a living donor, voluntary and anonymous, someone who had registered long ago and completed every step a person had to complete. And now everything matched, and they needed her to sign some papers. Mary sat at the small table in the administrative office, on the first floor beneath the fluorescent lights, and she signed. She signed here, signed there, and her hand shook so badly that the second signature didn't resemble the first. Then her eyes stopped. In the lower corner of one page was a small line, printed in the kind of type no one ever read, showing the date the donor had registered. August of last year. She read it again. Then she read it once more. The month of August last year was before she had ever heard the name Halloran, when she was still pushing the cart with the squeaking wheel through the 7th floor corridor every night, when the ring was still inside the tin, and no one in the world knew who she was. She stood and walked into the hallway. On the row of pale blue plastic chairs, beneath a wall clock that ran slow, a man in a wrinkled coat was sitting there folding a newspaper. His left sleeve was rolled up, and there was a small bandage at the bend of his arm. Mary stopped dead in the middle of the corridor. "You," she said. Fen finished folding the newspaper, made the edges square, then placed it on the chair beside him. He didn't stand. "I registered long ago, Miss Quillan," he said. "Before any of this trouble even started." Mary couldn't speak. "Why?" she asked after a very long time. Fen looked down at his hands. "Because you always put my coffee on the right corner of my desk," he said. 3 years. Every night. No one told you to do it. No one told you I was left-handed. You noticed on your own. Everyone in that building passes through my doorway every day, and to them, I'm the chair sitting in the corner. You were the only person in that building who saw me." He gave one very small shrug. "I was only giving it back." Mary stood there and understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. That she had spent 3 years believing the only thing she had to give was her labor, and it turned out that wasn't true. The thing she had given without ever counting it, the thing so small she couldn't even remember doing it, had returned to her on the very morning she needed it most. She had once studied nursing. She had left during her 2nd year. She knew every step of everything that would happen over the coming days, knew it better than some of the people who would explain it to her. And for 3 years she had sat beside that bed, with all that knowledge lying dead inside her mind because no one allowed her to hold anything. Now she didn't need to hold it. Someone else was holding it for her. She went up to the 4th floor. Daylight had fully broken beyond the window at the end of the corridor, the first light of the morning, and inside the room a 9-year-old child had just opened her eyes and was looking at her sister, standing at the foot of the bed in a black dress. "Sis," the little girl said, her voice still hoarse. "Did you go to a party?" Mary smiled, and it was the first time in many years that she smiled without trying to hide something behind it. "Yes," she said, "I went to a party." The little girl looked down at her sister's left hand, saw the ring, and didn't ask anything, because children always know where not to dig. Then her eyes moved toward the doorway. A man stood there without entering, holding his hat against his chest with both hands like a schoolboy waiting outside a classroom to hear his name called. "Who are you?" the little girl asked. August Vantris opened his mouth, the man who could silence an entire long table beneath the Calumet docks merely by tapping one finger against the wood, stood in the doorway of a hospital room and couldn't find the words for nearly 3 seconds. He said, "I'm the man who will go to your parent meeting with you next week. If you'll allow me." The little girl looked at him for a moment. Then she turned toward her sister and said, in the most serious voice a 9-year-old could manage, that in that case he had better leave early because Miss Bramble hated it when anyone arrived late. Then she pointed toward the little table beside the bed, where a sheet of paper lay face down, and told her, "All right, you can look now." Meredith Quillan entered that warehouse as a night shift cleaner. No one at all. A name none of those 300 people knew how to read. She walked out, still a night shift cleaner. Only one thing had changed. Now the entire city knew how to read her name. And perhaps that is what this story hopes to leave with us. That a person's dignity doesn't lie in the uniform they wear to work, or the table where they are allowed to sit, or the wall where they are forced to stand, but in whether anyone truly sees them. That in every room we enter, there are always people quietly making that room cleaner, warmer, and kinder. And the finest thing we can do isn't to bestow favors upon them, but simply to see them, call them by name, and ask them one question about their lives. And that the smallest acts of kindness we perform without bothering to count them, a cup of coffee placed in the right spot, a word of concern, a single look, may return to us on the very morning we need them most. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day you can hear more compelling stories like this one. How did Meredith and August's story make you feel? Have you ever met someone like Fen in your life? Or have you ever been the person standing against the wall in a crowded room? Leave us a comment. We truly want to hear what you feel deep inside your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.